When we left off in the previous lesson, we successfully got the unit test to work. However, everything is hard-coded. It's time to refactor and really think about the implementation. Is this what I really want? It's simple, but I foresee a problem with the way that we've implemented this so far. I'll need to create a new instance of the class and then immediately call the findById, as you see here in this unit test, passing in the contract ID that I want to search for. While I've not implemented this yet, all the way down to the persistence layer, I would expect to make a call into the persistence layer to retrieve the data. What I retrieve from the persistence layer, I would then populate in the properties of the new instance of my object. Now, the problem with this approach I see is twofold. First of all, I'm relying on a certain order of operations. If someone were to create an instance of the new contract, like I do here in line number 12, but instead reference the expiration date immediately, it would raise an exception because the expiration date is not available, or at least the data would be null. I guess that would be the best case scenario. So it's not a good idea whenever you create an API, which is essentially what we're doing here by starting with a class project type and creating methods and properties that implement our problem domain. It's best whenever you're creating an API to not rely on things being done in a certain order. In this case, we shouldn't have to rely on findById being called in order to fill all the properties that we'll need to use later on. So that's the first problem. Second problem is that I've delegated way too much responsibility to this findById method, and probably to the entire class. And I think that the single responsibility principle applies here, the S in solid. So just have a question for you to think about here. Can you identify in this class what we're doing here that would violate the SRP, the single responsibility principle? And just to give you a hint, it's subtle, but it's an important distinction. Well, there are two responsibilities at a class level, and they're both conceptual. They are, first of all, creating and calling into the persistence layer, and then secondly, performing all the functions and responsibilities of being a domain entity. In other words, if I were to continue down this road, there would be way too much emphasis on instantiation. I'd like to take those responsibilities and give them to another class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another class, and it'll have the sole responsibility of creating an instance of a contract. And it'll be able to work with the persistence layer to get the data that's needed at creation and then populate the new contract's properties. So once we have a new contract and have the state of that new contract ready, the pure contract object itself can be used solely for its intended purpose, to represent a contract in our problem domain. So to right this wrong, what I'm going to do is redo the unit test to include the notion of a contract service. So let's go ahead back to this. I'm going to comment all of this out that we've done so far, and I'm going to start over. So here's what I'd really like to see now that I'm refactoring the first unit test. I'm going to add a contract service. Again, the purpose of this service in my mind is to create new instances of contracts, and it will negotiate with the persistence layer to grab the data that we need out, and it will return back a new contract. So we'll do something like this: contract equals contract service, and we'll call its get by ID, and we'll pass in the contract ID, like so. All right. So now what we can do is make sure that we get what we're expecting here. So I'm going to do a few assertions. I'm going to make sure that instance of type, and I want to make sure that a contract is indeed type of a contract. I want to assert that is true that the contract expiration date, contract.expiration date is greater than date time.now. Now you might be wondering, well, hold on a second. We already have an expiration date property. Why isn't it showing up here as part of contract? Because we haven't created this getById method yet, and ultimately we'll want that to the return type contract. So it'll return a new instance of a contract class. Since we're just calling var here, this won't work. Now if I were to change this var to contract, I think, yeah, that expiration will go away. Either way is fine. I don't really have a strong opinion on that. I generally prefer var when I'm creating production code because I'll just let the compiler worry about types and such. But if it makes IntelliSense work a little bit easier, that's fine by me as well. All right, finally what I want to do is also make sure that the contract ID is indeed the contract ID that we passed in. Now you might see that some of these look a little silly, like for example, making sure that we have gotten back the contract ID that we intended to. However, again, this is really accomplishing a couple of things. It forces me to implement contract ID, which I know I'm going to need. But more importantly than that, it is a test for the future to ensure that during instantiation, that this getById is populating all of the properties and that it's not doing something funky or special and returning back something else from the persistence layer. So if there's any changes in the future to this getById method, I want to make sure that it is returning back values in the properties of my new contract that are sensical. All right, so that's the intent. So what I've done, I've broken this dramatically, but this more closely represents what I ultimately want. So now let me go ahead and implement the new contract service class and refactor the contract class as well. And I'm going to remove that old findById method. So let's go ahead first of all and implement the new contract service. So I'm going to right click and select add new class. And I'll call this contract service. And then inside of this contract service, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the body of this for the most part. Just yank that right out. You can see I put some extra text in here as well that helps me figure out what it is that I want to accomplish in here. Actually, I need to do this. This inside. There we go. And what we're going to do here is var contract equals new contract. Great. And then we'll go contract ID. So change this to contract ID. And then expiration date equals new dies, and then we want to return that new instance of contract. Also want to make sure that we can go public. Great. Okay, so as you can see, the new getById method closely resembles the findById from our contract class. The only real difference is that here we're creating an instance of contract and then populating its values and then returning it, as opposed to just doing it all internally. So now I can actually completely remove this findById. All right, so let me save all that, and now when I take a look at the test, it looks like for the most part it worked. Here, let me see. Yeah, I don't have this exactly working. My intent was to pass in a string that represents the contract ID, and I don't have that implemented here. So again, the test, the way I would expect to call this, is driving the design of my class here. So I would want to go string contract ID, like so. All right, now again, this isn't perfect, and it's still hard-coded, but I feel good about this, at least better than I did before. Okay, so now let's go ahead and build everything, and then we'll test it up. Run all the tests. And it succeeded. Great. So we made an improvement to the creation of the contract object by delegating the responsibility of its creation to a new class. We've encapsulated the instantiation of the contract in the contract service class. Now, admittedly, we have two classes where we once had just one class. That does add a little bit of complexity. So now you have to look in two places instead of just one to understand what you need to know about creating and working with contracts. Generally, however, this is acceptable because each class is now more cohesive. They have a distinct responsibility, also known as the single responsibility principle. Moreover, when we get a new instance of contract now, that contract instance will be in the proper state. We don't have to worry about that order of operations problem that we talked a little bit ago, where the contract properties are not being populated yet because we forgot to call that find by ID method on our new object instance. Another potential concern is that these two classes are coupled together, and if you recall from the Application Architecture Fundamental series, I said that coupling is bad. However, what I really said, or what I meant to say, was that coupling is bad between layers. Inside of a given layer, you can't avoid some coupling. You should keep it at a minimum, but still, if you have a class like the contract service, its only purpose is to generate new instances and to populate their properties of the contract itself. Okay, so now the major complexity is in this contract service.getById that we're looking at on screen right now. It's still not quite right, and it needs to be refactored. Take a look at it and determine what the problem is. There's probably a couple of problems, but we're going to address one of them in the next lesson. We'll see you there.